I just use my regular voice. So welcome to session 4 of the 2026 or spring 2026 University Writing and Research Conference. So my name is Jacob Richter. I am one of the organizers for the conference. We have a panel right now called Mass Media Metamorphosis, Performing Identity Under Constraint. Make sure that you sign in the sign-in sheet if you came in a little bit or if you just came in, to make sure you get credit for your UW course. Our 3 presenters will speak all in a row. I'll introduce them and give you some context about their presentations. And then we'll take questions at the end. Make sure that you're writing down possible questions as you listen to the presenters speak. Questions are excellent if they are just for one person. They're even better if they apply to the entire panel. So keep that in mind as well. So with that, we'll start with our first presenter. Tyler Lai is a freshman undergraduate in the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences and is from New Jersey. His current studies focus largely on life sciences and economics. His presentation is titled Metamorphosis of the Mind, a psychological case study of Sibylla Merian's representation of human nature. Let's give it up for Tyler.
So welcome to my presentation, everyone. Metamorphosis of the Mind, a psychological case study of Sibylla Merian's representation of human nature. And just some background, my UW was about Dutch painting at the National Gallery of Art, but after that it was shut down because of the government shutdown. We've shifted to the National Gallery of Women in the Arts, which at the time had a exhibit women artists from Antwerp to Amsterdam, which largely focused on the lesser known women artists of the same era. And so for my final, I focused on Sibylla Merian, and here's some of her prints on the left, along with Johannes Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring, a quintessential piece and artist from the same era. So going into this paper, I was kind of...
Just a little louder.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
going into this paper, I was very unsure of what direction I wanted to take and kind of what I wanted to include. So I kind of created these guiding questions for myself during my research to kind of just get more information about her. And so I wanted to focus on who she was, what did she do, and why does she matter? So my research process was fairly simple. It started with a consultation with my professor and to kind of brainstorm which direction we could go in and what we can incorporate into my paper. From there, we went to the library and I kind of checked out any and all books that Eccles had about Merian. And it was great because these research books had both general and specific information. Oftentimes, these authors would incorporate extensive works cited or reference specific individual sources that were then beneficial for my own paper. And so just a couple of examples of how my research progressed. One of my research books, The Flowering of Ecology, it made reference to a bunch of different sources. In this case, this is a review of one of my artist Merian's publications. And this was mentioned in the book as a part of the work cited, and I was then able to research that further on my own. Again, it made reference to a letter from Merian to another one of her fellow artists, and I was able to find online an entire repository of translated works from her. And even in some cases, the author of the research book will incorporate their own research into whatever they're trying to prove. And in this case, the author kind of put together this schedule of Merian's year to year based on the different projects she was juggling at the time. And then this was another example of what I was able to incorporate into my own paper. But ultimately, for my findings, I learned that after some preliminary research that she was a pioneer in the fields of entomology and botany, which is the study of bugs and plants. She was kind of the first person to fuse the two together and think of them as intertwined subject rather than two different specialties. Even in her first publication that we see on the right, is the culmination of all of her research from her 2-year expedition to Suriname, where she researched over 150 different species of plants and insects. And in this case, she was the first person to kind of pioneer the idea of metamorphosis, or the idea that insects have different stages of life and how they progress through each one. And this kind of challenged the scientific consensus at the time, which was that many people regarded spontaneous generation as the way that insects kind of propagated. And spontaneous generation is the idea that living matter was able to spawn from non-living material. In this case, many believe that bugs were able to spawn from mud and dirt. And most of her art, it kind of reflects this idea of this intertwinedness between a plant species and an insect species. We kind of see how she captures the fluid dynamics of life and how the motion of each stage of insect or the plant life, even in the details, we see little holes on the leaves, which serves scientifically to show how both species are interconnected, but also artistically how she was able to capture this kind of symbiotic nature of life. So given my findings, I kind of realized that her journey and her life's work captured what it means to be human and human nature. And from there, I kind of broke it down into these 4 different categories of psychological categories of day-to-day experiences. The first being nature versus nurture, the second being curiosity, the third being perseverance, and the fourth being legacy. For the first subject, nature versus nurture, I focused on how Merian was a product of both her environment that she grew up in and the genetics of her parents. In the right section in figure 1, we see a picture of the gardens of Heidelberg Castle by her father. And despite him dying while she was relatively young, his etching technique was used by her throughout her entire career. And then in figure 3, we see a picture from her stepfather, and it's one of the first pictures that show plant species with an insect species. And while not to the same degree of scientific accuracy of Merian's works, it's interesting to note that they do share the similarity of bonding different subjects in the same piece. For my second slide, curiosity, it kind of focuses on how her curiosity was a motivator and propelled her to the research that she continued through the rest of her life. Here is an excerpt from the preface of her self-publication that I showed earlier. And basically, it kind of elaborates on how, without the facet of life, curiosity that we kind of experience every day, she would have never been able to explore and break the boundaries of science. And it shows that even trivial questions about day-to-day experiences, maybe hows or whys, it just proves that they're essential to human life and how we progress. For my third section, I chose perseverance, and this section focuses on how she was able to power through and constantly overcome all the adversities and obstacles she faced throughout her career, namely how she was a woman in male-dominated fields, in the dominated fields of art and science. And it kind of reflects the experience that we all face at some time where we have to traverse obstacles to achieve our goals. But this is a quote that I showed previously, the scathing review in an article about her work. And despite all, she did persevere and continue her research despite the scientific community, the artistic community, and what they had to say about her. For my last section, I chose legacy. And on the right, we see a quote from a 1950s Intro to Entomology book. And on the left, we see a translated quotation from one of her other publications. And here we kind of see how she was erased from history. But despite all, it doesn't matter what history has to say about someone. Our legacies are crafted through the actions and through our actions and the way we act in the face of these obstacles. Merian continued to do her work for the people, fairly well knowing that she would probably be ignored by the scientific community and the artistic community, still opting to create art and publish works for society. And it is in this that her journey through life, it kind of exemplifies what it means to be human and highlights her prowess as both an artist and a scientist. It would not be fair to equate her name to that of Johannes Vermeer or scientist Albert Einstein, though she does deserve equivalent recognition. Her name deserves to stand on its own, being synonymous with the work she conducted, the discoveries she achieved, and her contributions to society. Her work was coveted by those of the likes of Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, and King George III of Britain. So her work was coveted by the aristocracy. It deserves their recognition, and respect of her peers, the scientific community, and a cemented place in history. Thank you.
All right, folks, so our next presentation is titled Masking Desire, Queer Self-Representation in Confessions of a Mask in Barakai. Our presenter is Liz Lee. Liz is a freshman majoring in neuroscience who enjoys photography, literature, and tea making, and has lived in Washington, D.C. and Copenhagen with family from Beijing. Take it away, Liz.
So can everyone hear me well right now? We'll be talking about masking desire, queer self-representation in Confessions of a Mask and Barakai. So first of all, not all of you might have heard Confessions of a Mask or Barakai. I will give a brief example of what kind of media it is. So Barakai is a photography collection by Aiko Soho, who is a famous photographer from Japan with Yukio Mishima as the model, and it incorporated like various Renaissance iconographies, and first published in 1963, with many versions published afterwards. And a little bit about how I went into this topic. So Confessions of a Mask is a novel by Yukio Mishima, and when I was in a thrift store, I found this book. It was pretty interesting, and then I went online to read some discussions and analyses of the book and the author himself. So yeah, I came across Barakai and looked at some of the images. It was pretty interesting, and I found some connections with the novel. So a bit more about the novel. Confessions of a Mask, it is a semi-autobiography written by Yukio Mishima, published in 1949. For you who that are familiar with history, that's like after Japan surrendered in 1945, a very significant period with literature. So it's about the protagonist, Kochan, a young man who struggles to same-sex desires in that same time period. And thus he was forced to form a mask to hide his identity and self-expression. And from there on, we start to have a few little questions, such as what does he see in suffering in particular that attracts him so much? And what's so beautiful about those wounded bodies? And how does that furthermore resembles his life and his thoughts? So this is basically a summary of what I felt like after reading the book and the looking through the photography. So Confession, for me, I think it bridges between the novel and photography, and it shows what he tries to hide away from society, and thus it's building a bridge between these two media. And now a bit more about how I came up with my question. So I think this is probably the most difficult part of all in the draft formulating process. But as my professor suggested, reading some scholarly articles would really help. And it did, because even though, so I learned about the Japanese tradition, such as nanshoku, which is basically male-to-male relationships that was considered regular and encouraged in traditional Japanese societies before westernization. Even though this concept didn't really necessarily come up in my essay, but it did help me to build a stronger foundation for my knowledge, and eventually it's pretty useful in the process. So yeah, I was able to refine my question and look closer into the westernization process and the post-war time period. So in other words, we can simplify the question into why would a man turn his life into a mask? And what comes after that? Well, let's look at some specific evidence and images from Barakai and compare that with the novel. So both these images are from Barakai. I think I categorize them as the archetype of Mishima's desire. You don't really see a lot of similarities in them except for the color and shading, but both of them reference Saint Sebastian. So the image on the left, you can see Mishima, he's the main focus, the model in the middle, and in the back, it uses a double exposure technique, referencing a zoomed up version of Saint Sebastian's facial expressions. The other one, you don't really see anything in particular, but there is the figure of Saint Sebastian with his face covered by a clock, and Mishima's face is on the bottom. It's not very obvious. Even though they're both Saint Sebastians, these two images really differ in what they emphasize. One focuses, so the one on the left focuses on more I think, psychological suffering, physical suffering, while the other one on the right emphasizes the serene beauty and martyrdom. You see his face is covered. You don't really see whether he is Saint Sebastian or not. And the Western elements, such as the patterns and the castle, I think that could also be a representation of the Westernization process. We will also be seeing some similar examples of two images later on. And I think this alignment with both images kind of recreates the protagonist's queer awakening in Confessions of a Mask, where Saint Sebastian was the main focus of how he felt he had the desires, and presents pain, idealized masculinity. So through this imagery, he visualizes a queer identification that's intense, aestheticized, and deeply internal. In Barakai, we know that he stages his own desires instead of writing about it. The next part is pretty different because later on in the novel, as he grew up and grew into adulthood, the protagonist developed a need to perform normality in front of society, his friends, his family, and we're able to find similarities in Barakai again. So this image here, it appears in Barakai, but the reason why I want to pull it up is because it's pretty different to other images, because there are two people. Normally, Yukio Mishima, he himself is the model, but now we have another person, which is really rare. And what we can see here, they're both half naked, of course, but you feel that alienation and lack of intimacy, which makes the stage feel very staged. And I think it associates to the protagonist's attempts in Confessions of a Mask to perform heterosexuality for social approval, such as the time where he tried to date a girl called Sonoko, but he failed to feel desire for her, as well as being encouraged by his friends to go to a prostitute to prove his masculinity and something that he's not. Also worth noticing the split lighting on his face. I think that just reinforces the divide between the identity he presents and the identity that he conceals. So in the next slide, we have something similar to Saint Sebastian. Both of these images, they reference Venus. One on the left is Giorgione's Sleeping Venus. The other one references Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. And even though they both reference the same goddess herself, but it does represent something very different. So for example, the one on the left, you don't really see Venus there. Why? Because the upper part of her body is entirely cut. She is only showing below her stomach. And the other one, she is in the very focus of the image with an eye focusing on her body. So from there, we can see that the left demonstrates a more sensual, a more sexual ideal, whereas the other one is more divine, is more godly, and allows us to see her entirely as a whole being instead of only her body. So these images place Mishima among two contrasting female ideals, and they symbolize the heterosexual desire he's expected to perform. And by physically inserting himself into those pictures, we see that Mishima exposes how distant those ideals are away from his authentic desire. And this turns Venus into a part of the mask rather than an object that he feels attracted to. And this could be why the image referencing Botticelli's ideal Venus includes an eye, because that could be a symbol of society's ideal norms and how they see beauty. So in the next slide, we have our conclusion here. Summarizing everything that I've said, I think Mishima uses both text and image to construct a queer self-representation that must navigate through Western post-war norms. And Confessions of a Mask explores this topic through an interior confession, whereas Barakai uses the performance of his body to express what cannot be said directly. And across both, the mask becomes not just concealment, but more of Mishima's method of transforming his tension and internal struggles into art. Yep, thank you.
So folks, our next presenter is Michael Gallen. Michael Gallen is an international affairs major interested in the intersection of politics, mental health, and social media. He is from Las Vegas, Nevada. Michael's title of his presentation is Be the Best or Die, an analysis of the black pill and masochism on TikTok.
All right, I'm going to try and go fast because I was anticipating more time, so just tell me if I'm going too fast. But odds are you've probably seen this image on TikTok edits. And this is the black pill. It's a trend, it's a movement, but more aptly, it's a worldview that describes the world in terms of lookism, in terms of everything being determined by looks, and genetic fatalism. So I want to first start with just this image here. This is a screenshot of a YouTube video. This is a famous conservative kind of activist, Michael Knowles, and he's interviewing the face of the black pill, clavicular. And in this interview, something really interesting happens. Michael Knowles asked Clavicular about his views on the upcoming election between Gavin Newsom and J.D. Vance. These are two right-wing figures, and Clavicular is I would rather vote for Gavin Newsom because Gavin Newsom mogs, and J.D. Vance is subhuman, he's ugly, and he's fat. Which I think is very interesting because this is mainstream. This is one of the most viewed videos on Michael Knowles' channel. So Clavicular's influence, his popularity in relation to the black pill assumes this kind of mainstream conservatism. And then these are photos from the Democrats' TikTok channel, or TikTok page. And they're using the same type of black pill logic language that I'm describing in the rest of my project. So this is kind of something that subsumes ideology and has become really mainstream. So my project tries to analyze why this is the case, why this has happened. So first I want to say what the black pill is, then I want to say how it's spread, and I'm going to integrate masochism into that. What are the impacts, and then what to do about it. So the black pill is, easily put, the idea that looks are destiny, that looks affect everything. They affect your status in life, your success in dating, but also your success in career prospects, your success in life in general. So if you're born a certain way, if your jawline's recessed, if your eyes are too far apart, you're screwed in life. That's the idea of the black pill. In the academic sense, the black pill is an epistemology. It's a way of viewing the world as something based on lookism, something based on genetic determinism, something where if you're born a certain way, it's unfixable, unchangeable. So just analyzing how this kind of movement started, and how it proliferated into the mainstream. It started roughly 10 years ago in these alt-right kind of echo chambers, 4chan. You probably know, recognize some of these. Some of these you probably don't recognize. But these are very far-right kind of misogynistic forums, image boards, populated mainly by incels. I think we all know what incels are, but involuntary celibates. These are men who self-describe themselves as being unable to find success romantically or in sexual encounters. And when all these people get together in these kind of image board, echo chambers, they talk about their grievances, they talk about their shared, misogyny and stuff of that nature. And they come to the conclusion that there must be something behind this, and that's how they kind of get to the idea of the black pill. They think, okay, well, we're not successful in dating, we're not successful in sex, therefore, society itself must be based on looks because we're not good looking. So obviously this is very extreme. There's also obvious misogynistic tones. So how does this spread beyond these image boards? And I identified 3 ways in which both the form and the substance of the black pill are proliferated and how they're maintained. First is slang diffusion. So this is about the form of black pill language. That would be what the Democrats post, the suffix maxing or the pilled or that type of stuff. When algorithms pick this up, it becomes really easy to just throw into any TikTok, throw into any video. Everyone knows what you're talking about. So the algorithm spreads this. People include these in just unrelated topics like cat edits or politics, for example, because it really gets clicks and it really gets the language flowing, which allows this kind of language to flow into the mainstream. The second way has to do with the substance, and that's normification. This is just where the ideas of the black pill, the genetic determinism, the fatalism, they integrate themselves into common sense kind of narratives of how the world works. So this will be like explainer videos, or like people analyzing like dating or like statistics and that type of stuff. And they implement the black pill's logic, the idea that looks matter, that looks overdetermine everything, as a kind of neutral explainer for why these relations happen. And that allows this kind of overt, like misogynistic and extremist ideology to seep into the mainstream by presenting itself as a neutral analysis. Then before I talk about the third way that the black pill is maintained, let's touch on some of the impacts. You can see the statistics here: 95% meet criteria for depression, 93% for anxiety. Obviously, incels are not like the happiest people. They believe in a really, depressing ideology. Basically, they believe that they're cooked, and there's no improving their lot in life. And you can see on the right, there's these, quotes from incels. They also have suicidal ideation. So why do they believe in this ideology, which is clearly harmful? It's killing them, and it doesn't advantage them in any way. It doesn't position them as like anything of status in society. And that's where masochism comes in. And I think this happens on 3 levels. The first level is on the individual level. So when people post in these incel forums, or now on TikTok and Instagram and more mainstream platforms, they perform inferiority. They proclaim their own inferiority, and that gets them validation from other people who relate to them. So incels post about being incels, about not having success in dating and life, and other incels validate that. These people are typically very lonely. They're isolated, and they get validation. Some of the only validation they get in their life is from other incels. So what does that mean? It means they become attached to their identity as incels, because that's the only way they can actually get this type of validation from others. So it becomes a part of their identity. It becomes a part of their way of controlling their own narrative about their life. Yes, they're proclaiming they're incels, but instead of others proclaiming that, they're proclaiming that onto themselves, which gives them a sort of agency that they don't have in other aspects of their life. And of course, that feeds into itself. Once you get validated, you keep going back for that validation because that's the only validation you're getting. That's pain and pleasure. I think that's the definition of masochism. On the group level, some of these studies that I've looked at, and some of these academic papers have looked at how these forums view depression as a social currency. So they will these forums and TikTok will actively police people who aren't incel enough. If you look too good, if you're too successful, if your genetics are too good, they don't actually include you in these groups because you're no longer an incel, you're just a normal person. You can't relate to the rest of the group. So the group is incentivized to be actively depressed, actively disadvantaged, because that's the only way you get credibility in this group. So the group actively polices your behavior and discourages you from improving your lot in life. So that's how the group manages masochism, as a kind of encouragement to stay in the group. And on the third level, it happens on a societal level. So this is incels will position themselves as outside of the hegemonic masculinity because they say they suffer from it. They say Chad is 10 out of 10 and I'm 1 out of 10, and therefore I'm not benefiting from the system. But notably, when they talk about the system and talking about how bad the system is, they don't blame structures, they don't blame structures of wokeism. They'll either say it's neutral, this is just inevitable, our life's cooked, and there's nothing we could do about it. Or since they're incels and they're misogynists, they'll blame women for the system. They'll be women created this system, when that's probably not true. And they just that turns their grievances into makes them the priority. And that maintains the system because they're not able to actually critique the system that oppresses them on a fundamental level, which maintains systems of misogyny, but also maintains systems of oppression for them, which means it's masochism on a more societal level. So we've covered 3 things: how the black pill's form has spread, how its content has spread, how it's been maintained. But I lied, there's actually 2 more ways the black pill spreads, and I think these are the most important ways. The 4th way is how TikTok actively proliferates the black pill. So in doing my research, there were these TikTok documents released, part of court procedures, and internal documents, and they literally said that they tasked moderators with censoring people who deemed too ugly, too poor, or too disabled. They also, take active steps in promoting algorithms that promote attractive people. So they're not only taking algorithmic steps, but also manual steps in forcing this kind of like pretty, like beautiful kind of image onto the TikTok, onto TikTok. So what does that mean for like black pillars? Well, they see, when they go on TikTok, all they see is attractive people. All they see is attractive people succeeding. So effectively, TikTok is forwarding their own thesis back at them. So when, you know, we're like critiquing, you know, their kind of worldview, TikTok is actively promoting this worldview. TikTok is actively promoting the black pill central thesis. And the fifth way is that our culture does value looks. You know, maybe not to the same extent where it's like over-determines everything and, you know, there's no improving your life. But to some extent, society does care about looks, probably far too much. And these incels are probably like the least privileged by this kind of looks-based system. Yes, they, you know, factor into maintaining that system, but the system itself is harmful to them. It's harmful to everyone involved. And that's like certainly a very insidious fact, which makes the black pill somewhat makes the black pill like consistently prevalent, or at least its ideas consistently prevalent, and the subjects it produces prevalent. So what is to be done? I think there's three things. First is the easiest, which is just TikTok shouldn't be censoring disabled and ugly people. It shouldn't be promoting people algorithmically that are, you know, attractive or like conventionally attractive. I think there's obviously things that we could do to prevent that. There's transparency mechanisms that we can implement to prevent TikTok from doing things like that and other social media platforms. I think the most obvious kind of objection to this is like just the free speech argument, but notably, TikTok already intervenes on free speech. They promote certain voices over others. They actively and directly censor certain people and certain groups of people. So I think that argument's not very salient, and this is the easiest thing we could do. The second is that these people who tend to like fall into these incel and misogynistic spaces are very like lonely. They're very isolated from society. And that's kind of how they like develop these radical worldviews. We could probably do some kind of social intervention into this, either like, you know, counseling, free mental health, that type of stuff. I think this is significantly harder because of like political pressures, but I think it's still feasible. But the third is societal interventions, which would need fundamentally changing our culture into one distanced from looks, and looks based on like looks as a major metric in how we evaluate human worth in our society. I think that's extremely difficult because it's not a policy fix. It's a kind of fundamental reorganization of our culture and our society. That requires an enormous political will, but also enormous like personal and collective will. And due to the difficulties of even getting the first option, even passing regulations on TikTok, I think we'll see that the black pill, its logic, will continue in the near future. And the fact that those like clips of the Democrats and that like Republican clip happened 1 month after I already finished my research paper shows that this is still an ongoing phenomenon. These people are only getting bigger and the black pill is only spreading. So, thank you.
Well, so folks, it seems like we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Feel free to write a question down if you have one at the tip of your tongue, or to start thinking and letting your ideas marinate. Does anyone have a question? Want to start us off?
I have a question for Michael. So how did you go about writing like peer-reviewed journals for like a topic that I would assume has less research than
So I was actually surprised. It has a significant amount of research on it. Not like up-to-date research, because a lot of it is like, because of how fast these trends move, a lot of the research is outdated. But there is a lot of research on like incels, for example, and that's kind of what I based my research on. A lot of like my analysis is my own analysis, and I had to kind of take pieces from what I observed, take pieces from like these news articles, but also take pieces from those older academic articles to like formulate my thesis and my research.
You guys, like, in deciding the topics, do things that, like, were interesting to you guys personally? If that makes sense. Do you not hear me?
No, I heard you.
Oh.
No, I'm just agreeing. Like, yeah, it's like something interesting to me. I see it all the time on TikTok. You know, it's like always on my feed, whether I want it to be on my feed or not. So it's something I observed and was something like I wanted to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, same for me. I think interest really helps with picking a topic. If you just pick a random topic that you're not interested in, it's not gonna work that well.
For me, it was kind of different just because my class was so topical. I think you kind of include anything into your paper just to make any sort of connection that you can kind of see and just kind of run with it.
My question is also for Michael. What do you think like defines like conventional attractiveness? Like what like makes everyone like agree that oh like that person's attractive?
I think conventional attractiveness is probably determined culturally. So when I'm like talking about conventional attractiveness, I'm talking about like specifically Western conventional values. I didn't like focus on what makes someone conventionally attractive, but there are certainly like features identified by researchers that like are typically associated with like attractiveness, like symmetrical features, that type of stuff. But I don't think it's like determinative. Like I don't think we have like a biological kind of predisposition to view certain things as attractive or not. I think it's culturally constructed.
Michael, I have a follow-up question for you. Do women look smacks? And if so, or is it similar? Are there major differences?
I think it's a lot less. And because these are like male-dominated spaces, obviously the origins are male-dominated. But because it's so widespread now and because it's so prominent, there are women look smaxers, and they are on TikTok and they are public, and they do make, they do have edits of themselves. So obviously not to the same degree as for men, but certainly there are women look smaxers and women black pillars.
I have a question for Tyler. How are you able to balance like the scientific information you found and the visual information about the art, and then like the artist's personal story?
I think for me it wasn't that difficult just because this was a special case of she was both a scientist and an artist. So she used her art to continue her science and that was her medium for the world. That might be more difficult if your person is maybe one more than the other, but
What is like the hardest part of things like finding you guys' research?
I think for me it was like comparing actual evidence. Like sometimes if you're doing visual analysis, you wouldn't really know what's on there, and by that you just have to dig into a lot of like online resources or even offline resources. I think going to the library helps. Yeah.
I think for me it was kind of staying organized. Since most of my research were in books, I kind of did a bunch of post-its. Definitely stay organized and don't get lost in your own work.
Mine was just, there's a lot of information, and sorting through what's useful and what's not useful I think is really important. Even for my topic, which I think was like pretty specific, there was a lot of stuff and a lot of stuff that wasn't applicable. And just being able to look at sources at a glance and determining whether or not they'll be important for your paper is important.
I have a question for Michael. Would you say that waxing has been like around in forms such as things like body unifications and like beauty products and stuff like that before it was like that they were just saying waxing?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the idea that this is like a prevailing like kind of thing that our culture emphasizes is looks. So it's always been a thing. So when I'm like talking about the origins of the black veil, I'm specifically talking about the origins of this kind of like fatalistic view where looks are the only thing that matter, looks overdetermine everything. And that really started with the rise of these forums because they help produce these echo chambers, especially like online, Whereas like before it was a common sense kind of narrative, yes, looks matter, but they couldn't form these kind of extremist echo chambers that the internet like lends itself to.
The question for me is, did the artist that you discussed in your presentation have a lot of cultural significance in Japan, or was he kind of a lot more obscure? The subject matter was platformed at all in that era, given society as a whole.
Yeah, so the writer of the novel, he is, I don't know if a lot of you guys have heard about him, but he tried to come up with something for the emperor of the Japan at that time because they were going under such a modernization process that was really rapid, and eventually he suicided by doing seppuku. So yeah, he did have a lot of significance, whether in his literature, playwriting, or even politically. And a lot of people regard him as a fascist right now, but there are different opinions about him. So I think, sorry, what was the second part of your question again?
I was curious if he had managed to gain any significance while he was alive, given the subject matter was definitely a lot more taboo in the 1940s.
Yeah, I think people at that time had a lot of different opinions towards him, and he almost won the Nobel Prize. So yeah, he was pretty significant.
Well, so I have a question for the entire panel. When we were putting together a title for three different but some similarities for this entire panel, one of the terms we used was metamorphosis, or even I was just thinking in terms of transformation. Seems like Tyler, for you, not only are these artistic representations of plants, but also insects that are constantly evolving, changing, transforming. Liz, for you, I think that clearly this man and this author is putting a mask on his face, but also on his identity, his personality for a moment, and transforming himself, both his appearance to the outside world, but also his perception of himself, perhaps. And then with Michael, I think clearly this whole community, this entire group is determining their entire self-perception, their destiny on how they look, and they're trying to transform pretty actively. I think Michael kind of glossed over some of this, but some of these people I've heard are taking human growth hormones, steroids, breaking bones, stuff that is pretty out there, so as to improve their appearance, theoretically anyway. And I'm curious, what's the importance of transformation and metamorphosis to your project?
I guess I can start with that one. It was kind of a duality for my project because it itself went through kind of this metamorphosis of, because I didn't know where I wanted to start with, and so it kind of took on different forms as it evolved. But also for herself, she kind of went through these various changes and which reflected the societal pressures, of course, but also in specific relation to, she published certain pieces for various groups, particularly women who otherwise wouldn't have had access to such information. So in that case, her work also kind of transformed to these various different areas of expertise.
So for my project, I think since the novel itself is kind of a little bit of Bildungsroman, a growing up novel, he explains how he went through all those difficulties throughout childhood and adulthood. And it was 1940s, 1950s at that time. I think it really reflected how society's views are upon these individuals, and probably it helped a lot of others like him to navigate through those processes as well.
I think metamorphosis is a way in which people in these incels and these looks maxers, they still assume the premises of the black pill, which is looks are everything. But so they don't try and challenge that framework. Instead, they try and work within that framework. So the way they work within that framework is what they would call ascending, which is doing all these extreme things like bone smashing and taking these human growth hormones. This is ways in which they could ascend within this hierarchy but not challenge that hierarchy.
a student has a question, I want to wait. I was wondering, Michael, I think you talked about this the most so far, but the relationship between what your question, research question was, and what you found, what your own project sort of discovered or created, versus what the scholars had already done. And so I wonder if you could each talk about that. Like, what had the scholars already said about whatever's closest to your topic, and where is your own work departing from that in some way, or what's the relationship between what you yourself are arguing in your own research and your own analysis versus what other scholars had already done? So how are you building on them, or what's your relationship to them, so to speak? Michael, you can answer that too if there's more to say about that.
So since my artist, Merian, I feel like in the process of research with in specific relation to scholarly articles, her name is still recently being discovered. So most of their work was almost biographical and largely still discovering what had been lost. In my place in that, I feel like I was trying to assemble all these little bits and pieces together and further that argument in the sense of trying to take it to the next level of, okay, here's what we know, here's what else we also could know, and here are the arguments that, because of what we know, deserve to be kind of propelled forward. I think one of my key arguments was that she should be remembered as this separate entity. Oftentimes when discovering new artists or new things, they're often compared to more conventional people, and in that case, I think that's where I try to devolve and try to make a name for herself separately.
So for me, all of the research articles that I found previously were either based on literature only, comparative ones, or they're on historical aspects of how various elements might incorporate into the novels itself. So based on that, I learned a lot more about the topic itself, but there was nothing that I found, at least in the English-speaking world or publicly online, which has demonstrated a connection between the artistic side and the literature side. Yeah.
Most of the academic sources are focused on those like incel forms, and they haven't touched on how kind of the black pill has become so mainstream. So part of my project is piecing together different reasonings for why the black pill has become mainstream. Like, I take parts like the masochism stuff. That's really an analysis of the incel spaces. But the stuff about like slang diffusion and the stuff about TikTok's algorithm, those are things that have not been touched on, or those pieces have not been like brought together by academics, and that's where I think my project diverges.
I think it's fascinating. Your answer is very expected in some ways because it's a currently evolving topic, and so the scholars have studied aspects of it, but like you said, it's somewhat outdated or hasn't caught up. But I think it's always fascinating to see like a topic that's in some ways decades old or half a century old or centuries old, that there's still more that you all as students can discover that's on top of what the scholars have already done. And I think that's a point just worth applauding and amplifying. Y'all can applaud later, but.
Michael, I have a question for you. So when I was in high school, I learned about eugenics. We think of oftentimes of, say, like Nazis, white supremacists, that sort of group and topic. As you were talking about, TikTok and other platforms, having these incentives to boost the most good-looking, beautiful, oftentimes white, oftentimes able-bodied, all of these things, all of these people, these creators who embody that and look that way, that clearly these incel looks maxers people have internalized. Do you think that there's kind of it's not the same exact sort of eugenics, trying to breed the next generation of beautiful, successful people, but do you see connections to that historical lineage, or is it too different?
I think the historical lineage really comes in with this like idea of this like perfect and like perfected human form. I think the issue with like drawing comparisons is that the the way that TikTok kind of like operates is itself, like the reason why what they do what they do is ultimately because of society and how we have like cultural expectations for what we want to see in media. Even outside of TikTok, like advertising, we only see, you know, attractive, able-bodied people. And so TikTok isn't the like actively forwarding eugenic like kind of logic. I think if we're gonna like talk about eugenics, then it would be at the level of like just our culture values this kind of like eugenic oriented like forwarding of like beautiful, like able-bodied people.
I have another question, unless there's more students. This is maybe more for Tyler and Liz. You've talked about this, Michael, already in terms of identity. But how are each of your subjects, both of them are thinking about identity in some ways. Liz, you talked about that a little bit more explicitly, or like a photography project is kind of a process for this novelist to try to work through some identity questions visually now. Why do you think that was important for him to do it visually? Because he's a novelist. And then in your case, she's a scientist. I was really struck by the visual components of her science. And then something at the tail end of that where she's sort of, it's almost like she's apologizing for the science by saying, like, I hope these books inspire people to do like needlework. You know, like it's like she falls back into the kind of female zone that's been built for her by others. But these are like scientific illustrations demonstrating this, in some cases I take it, in some of her discoveries. And so I'm curious about those visual components of her identity as a scientist who is also a woman, and how is she expressing something there? I don't know, like how she doing visual identity, not in terms of self-portrayal, but like through the science.
So I think, well, first and foremost, I would say she's an artist first, just given the background of her parents and her exposure to art from a young age, but also given that, like I said previously, like her curiosity for the sciences, I feel like in a way she played the cards that she was dealt and tried to propagate in whatever disciplines that she could have and in conversations that she would have been accepted into. Not to say that she restricted herself to those conversations, but in the places that her work was more widely brought into with less friction, so to say. So often in these women groups, because they were disenfranchised by the gender norms, her work was more widely accepted into it, and she was more of a helper in those groups because her work was still published widely. She was a self-publisher, so her work made it out regardless. But I think in just these groups where she was more well-known, it was because it was more of a, they also relied on her work as well.
For me, I feel like there are two aspects. So first of all, he's trying to, because he's presenting in as many forms as possible, I think he's trying to influence the population at that time, which corresponds to how he basically led a group, protested to the king, committed suicide when the king basically rejected him. He's trying to spread that awareness to an extent. But another thing I found was that compared to a lot of other authors at Japan at that time, they were more conservative, meaning that they were doing a lot of things like in academia or staying within like writing newspapers. But Yukio Mishima, he is a different person and he had a lot of various interests, so could be explained to some extent that he was having a bit of fun.
I have a question for Liz. You mentioned that he is occasionally regarded as like a fascist. Is there a particular reason as to why?
So I'm not a historical person. I'm not really sure of why, but he wanted the emperor at that time to, like, he liked what's the word called? So he wanted the country to focus more on the emperor and the old, like, for example, the Tokugawa. I don't know if you know that, but those kind of influences, he wanted them to come back instead of Japan going into a more modern, a more westernized, a more like military-based society. Yeah, and some people might refer that to as fascism, but I think there are several interpretations, and it's open up to more discussion.
Make Japan great again? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, kind of.
I mean, it's kind of conservative in some ways, or maybe reactionary perhaps?
Yeah, but the thing is, like, in his literature, he didn't really promote war, as in what happened in World War II. His opinion was that he thought Japan being a military superpower kingdom was bad, and he wanted to go back and focus on more of the traditional and cultural heritage side.
Yeah, I have another question for Michael. I'm just like curious, did you see like any research or any trends in like how race played a role with like amongst the men, and like how like a pattern in that statistics or anything like that?
Yeah, so I didn't include this in my presentation here, but in my project, there were interviews with incels, specifically non-white, black and brown incels. And these people have like fully bought into the like white supremacist narrative of like white is right and the only thing beautiful is white. Like these people are actively describing themselves. I think the specific word is shit skin. Like that's the quote that I have. And these people are like, I wish I'm white. I wish I was white. I wish I was born white. You know, I was born this different race, and that's part of like why they think like they're like genetically, you know, discriminated against. So it's certainly certainly involved with white supremacy and this idea of like white beauty.
Well, it looks like we only have maybe 3 more minutes. I'll close this off. Many of us in the room are possibly beginning a research project right now in our own UW 1020 classes. I'm curious for the panel if you faced any big challenges in your research or writing process, and if so, how did you overcome those challenges?
I got into the problem of having too much like I wanted to say and too much I wanted to write about, and that created the issue where like the project isn't focused on like one thing, it's focused on like many different things. Like I thought like the subject I chose, I could like cover the whole subject, but what I found out is really you can't. So I had to narrow what I wanted to talk about in relation to the subject. So I didn't like talk about the specific like surgeries these people are getting and that type of stuff. I'm more focused on the social aspect, and I think that was the primary challenge.
So I think for me was I had basically no expertise in this area. I'm not a literature person. I'm not doing anything in arts, doing something STEM. But there's always, I think, reading really helps, and like basically you want to do something that interests you, right? So if you have that interest, it's easy to overcome any barriers by just doing a lot more.
Similar to Liz, I have no expertise in the arts whatsoever, but so for me, a big difficulty was kind of just starting and getting going with my research, and in that case, I think it's super beneficial to either meet with your professors or either just start checking out random books and see where that leads you.
Well, folks, do we have any final questions? Quick ones? All right, first off, great audience questions. Excellent work there. Let's give our panel one final round of applause.